you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
Today we'd like to introduce Andrew McLean. So Andrew's been involved in the horse industry pretty much for a lifetime. He's been coaching for more than 30 years as an accredited coach. In his own riding, he's won an advanced section of the famous Gawler three-day event. A few years ago, the World Championships were held there. So he's represented Australia in horse trials. He's shortlisted for the World Championships. He has been a competitor in state, national events and ridden at FEI level in dressage and eventing and show jumping to Grand Prix. So he's certainly had a lot of experience as a coach. He's also held a racehorse owner-trainer licence and raced bareback in both Australia and New Zealand in the 70s and the 80s. Now, since then, Andrew's gone on, done a lot of study. He's won the highest Australian science award, the Eureka Prize for Science. And this was to do with horses. So Andrew's in great demand as a trainer, teacher, coach and speaker. And he's established the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre, written 5 books, including an international bestseller, and also authored 35 peer-reviewed journal articles. So now Andrew's started training elephants in Nepal in 2007, so we'll ask him a little bit about that, which led to the establishment of a not-for-profit HELP, which means Human Elephant Learning Program. And now he's the Senior Vice President of HELP. So the cooperative project focuses on optimal management, welfare and training of elephants in Asia using innovative training techniques based on learning theory and the elimination of punishment. So we didn't talk about learning theory in the studies, but I'd like to talk about that a little bit later on. So I'd like to introduce you, Andrew.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew.
Nice to be here.
Andrew, I wanted to ask you about your favourite quote. Do you have a favourite quote? You've got one here that I know that Tom Roberts has inspired you. Do you have a quote that you'd like to tell the listeners?
Well, I'm not really into quotes a whole lot, but one that I did have, I think is important when you're training animals, is just a Mark Twain quote saying that kindness is the language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see. Because I think quite often when you're training animals and dealing with people and you get into difficult situations, it's easy for anger to be the first recourse rather than knowledge and understanding. And so I really like that quote because I just think we always have to basically put away our slings and arrows and think a bit more about what the problem is that we have and how we're going to sort it out in a more logical kind of way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's excellent. All right, Andrew, I want you to go back from even earlier than when you were racing bareback in Australia and New Zealand in the 70s and 80s and go back to like your first memories of horses, how you introduced to horses and what things were like when you first started.
Well, I came from a very horsey family. My grandfather was a show jumper in Queensland back in the early 1900s. My father was a show jumper and my mother was a very well-known show rider in Melbourne at the time of Kay Irving and people like that. And so horses were a part of our way of living. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to King Island with my family as a young teenager, and that was a haven for me. And also I was mad keen on animals. So, having horses for transport and fun on, plus living in an environment where there's lots of animals, that's really what got me going. But, I can't even remember when I couldn't ride. I just remember having a little Shetland pony called Cricket that I didn't like a whole lot. I was about 3. Mm-hmm. And the only way I could convince Mum and Dad of that was that I kept putting the saddle on the fence and rode the fence instead of the pony because the thing would bite and kick as I was saddling it up, and I had to do it all by myself. So, I had some fun with that. But no, I think all my brothers, I have 3 brothers, we all rode them, and 2 of them were professionals as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, and you've done well then as a coach and as a competitor, not just in one discipline, but in dressage, eventing, and also show jumping. So you've certainly done some cross-discipline training there. And then you went on. Now, tell me a little bit about your first thoughts of learning theory and horses and how the two could combine for your research.
Okay, well, I suppose, my father was an engineer, so I suppose I was always driven by a logical, mechanistic approach. And my background also academically, I'm a zoologist by my first degree. So as a scientist, I was always looking for clear-cut answers, because the thing we do know about animals and the way their bodies work and the way their behaviour works is it is very predictable in the sense of how it all works, the link up of all the neural pathways in the brain. It's just that we don't, we're still learning about the brain in science. It's probably the last frontier. It's difficult to really pin down in a lot of ways, but we're getting there. So I always sought a kind of logical answer to everything. And then as I was riding horses and starting to get into levels of eventing particularly, I wanted to find out more about learning. And my zoology degree didn't help a whole lot there, because zoology teaches you about the natural behaviours of animals, but not much about learning. Mm-hmm. And that's where I started to delve in my PhD into psychology and learning theory. And that's where a whole world opened up for me of understanding about processes of learning.
Okay. And if you had to come up with one or, even two or three things that you learned, so this is starting, so before you started the study, before you started, what are the three main or the one main key that you learnt through that research when you were doing your PhD?
Well, some really simple things. Like, for example, most of the things we do with horses in terms of riding and leading particularly, we use pressures of our reins and legs and lead reins and all of those things. And the pressure itself motivates an animal to do something because he wants to remove it. But it's actually the removal that is the important part. So the pressure basically itself motivates, but the removal trains. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The second thing, and that's important for all pressures to recognise that, because so many people get into trouble loading horses, trying to get a horse to go through a creek or something like that. Even when the horse stops at the jump, the pressure will often go away because the rider turns away or they think, that didn't work, so they'll try something else. So the horse just learns that whenever you stop the pressure, that's the behaviour he should give, and that's a behaviour that actually did stop the pressure. So recognising the vastness of that is a really important aspect. And it's a sort of thing that great trainers often know implicitly but don't explicitly know it,
Yes.
So they can't actually vocalise it. So a lot of what I learned was much about what good trainers do that they don't necessarily tell you, and not because they're concealing it, but just because they themselves don't actually know what it is that's the effective part of what they do. And I see the same thing with elephant trainers. I've seen exactly the same thing. It's almost a mirror image, because all these training techniques have been handed down over the centuries, but our understanding of learning is only 60-odd years old. Mm-hmm. And it explains so much. It's something everyone should learn. It really helps enormously. Horses that are scared of things, there's so many desensitisation techniques that you can use that are effective for almost every single problem that you need to desensitise the horse for. Mm-hmm. That's a big one. And so the second thing I learned, what we call classical conditioning, and that simply means that any regular event that happens just before an already known one soon comes to cue it. It soon predicts it. So, for example, if you want to teach a horse to walk on from the voice command, you would say walk on just before you give him the lead rein cue. Mm-hmm. And there are so many applications of that in just teaching an animal a cue. It's the reason why the old masters, all the way through to very good trainers today, recognise the importance that the light aid must come first, and that's because of the classical conditioning effect. Mm-hmm. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is really just about the vast application of habituation techniques when horses are afraid of things. And the main thing I think to keep in mind that I did learn that was quite a big moment for me was the fact that when horses are afraid of something and they learn to run away from it, it's really just how far their legs go and how fast their legs go that matters, that actually embeds it as a fear response. If they shy or bolt off from something that they're scared of, in the future, if they're scared of it, it's all to do with how fast and how far they went. And so next time, if you meet that particular stimulus, say, for example, the horse is scared of a letterbox or something like that, as you come past that letterbox, if he doesn't run as fast and as far, he will definitely diminish his fear of that letterbox, because what maintains it is that action. And it's exactly the same for humans when we're scared of things. If you're scared of heights, what you tend to do is withdraw. You look over the edge and you go, and then you step back. And it's the stepping back and the withdrawal that maintains the fear response. And that's part of what exposure therapy is about in human therapy, and certainly for horses, it's a really big one. The hard part is you don't want to raise the horse's arousal level too high. And so you can do it very systematically, but there's heaps of techniques that work on that principle of fast and far. There's overshadowing, where you compete with the scary stimulus for a mobility response of the horse. So you might step him forward and step him back as you gradually come forward with the clippers or the injection if he's scared of those things. You can teach him that if he's scared of moving objects like motorbikes, to chase objects when you ride him, for example, lead him. So if he's scared of motorbikes, you can get the motorbike in one place in the arena ahead of you, or the bobcat, whatever he's scared of. I do with even trams for police forces. And as soon as the machine goes forward, you immediately accelerate the horse. And then when the machine slows down and stops, you stop. And so you keep the horse really keen, and the horse itself starts to want to gain ground on that thing. And in the end, he'll go up to it and sniff it. Like he voluntarily, the chasing makes him feel confident and brave. And there's plenty of other ways to counter conditioning, where the scary stimulus now can be converted into a pleasant stimulus if you associate it with something good. Like, for example, if he's scared of clippers, turn the clippers on every time before he gets his dinner. And clippers, it changes the mental picture, the perception for the horse. So there are so many techniques. I've only tapped the surface just then, but that's the beauty of what science can do. It can really inform a lot. And it doesn't, the thing about science, we call it equitation science, it's not about, making equitation into a science. It's just about trying to understand it better, to help us understand those things that are difficult to understand. But also what I love doing is it gives coaches some understanding of what it is that works for great trainers and why they do what they do, their timing. And the moment they give the aid at a certain footfall, it's really, really relevant and efficient when they do it at the right time. And the top ones, like Charlotte Dujon dressage, for example, she does. But she doesn't necessarily know it implicitly that she's doing it at the right time, but she just feels it.
Sure.
But we can learn it.
Yep. All right. I want you to just think back now, and because you've got an absolute wealth of knowledge, is there a horse that you thought, I have really learnt quite a lot with this horse as an out, just one particular horse that you've learnt with?
Absolutely, yeah. I had a horse called Woodmount Magic that I bought for $300 and I ended up selling for $100,000, and he was the first horse in Australia to reach six figures. And he came to me at the beginning of my understanding of this knowledge, and he did all of his 3-day events. He only ever left home 12 times and got to advanced. He was an excellent horse in the dressage and the jumping phases of 3-day eventing, and had a very good gallop. I got him as a weanling, and I started to understand the importance of using pressures and releases at the right time, and just a few other things. I mean, I could have done it even better had I known now, but what I know now. But certainly, it worked really very well with him, and so he went all the way through his 3-day eventing just in a snaffle. I never had any other bit in his mouth. and he was like a Mercedes to ride. And when Vaughan Jeffries rode him, I lent him to Vaughan for Wandon once when he came as a sitting rider, and he still came up to me when I was in New Zealand some months ago and said to me that was the best trained horse he'd ever ridden. And
isn't that great?
He was like a Mercedes to riding cross country, and that was really just from using pressure and release so well. And he was before then I had a great little horse called Woodmount Enterprise that I rode in a Pelham, and I was just beginning to understand things with him, but it was all a bit too late. But then I got Woodmount Magic, and I made so many fewer mistakes with him. Mm-hmm. So he really was a big learning curve for me, and quite an experiment too. Having got him as a weanling, I did everything. I broke him in. I taught him to lead. I broke him in. Mm-hmm. I even raced him because I didn't own him then. The owner said I wasn't allowed to have him because he was bred to race. He was at a grand, both sides was Star Kingdom. Mm-hmm. So he was bred in the purple, as they say.
I got myself a race. Very good breeding, yep.
Yeah. So I got myself a race trainer's license so that I could keep hold of him. And he said, look, if I had a race trainer's license, I could race him.
Yes.
Well, I got a race trainer's license, and I think I was stone motherless last most races. And then he made the logical conclusion that it was probably my training and not the horse's fault. So we sent the horse to Michael Trinder, who was a much better trainer. This is when I lived in Tasmania. Mm-hmm. And Michael gave him quite a few starts and said, look, this is really a long, long stayer. It's got no sprint in it at all. And all of the early events, events for young horses, 2 and 3 year olds, 4 year olds, they were all sprints. So that counted for that. So the owner realised, well, he wasn't going to maybe make a great early racehorse. So I said, look, can I buy him? And he said, look, just break in a racehorse for me. That'll pay for him. And then off we went on this training tour, and he was the first horse that broke 80% in a dressage test too in the North East Dressage Championships. He was a pretty special horse. And then I sold him to Tim Collins in England. He came out looking for Eddie Stibbe, wanted to buy him. Well, offered me $60,000 for him at Wandon, and then the next year Tim Collins came out from England, and he's from Bermuda but resided in England, and offered me $100,000. So I said, well, yeah, that would really help me pay for my farm. So
that was sensational. I
never sold the horse either before since then for anything like that. I'm not a seller, but it really helped us go. And then the horse, he was unable to ride the horse in England after that, for various reasons. And but he was a stallion, so I think he made his money well and truly breeding. He's sired quite a lot of event horses in England.
Okay. All right. Look, you've had quite a few proud moments. Proud moments as a competitor, proud moments just within your own achievements, having a bestseller book. You've done quite a lot. What's your proudest moment?
I think there are so many of them. I don't really... I couldn't say winning any event was a proud moment. It was always a strange moment to me in some ways. I think I probably wasn't the greatest competitor. I wasn't really badly driven by that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think it was when I published a paper on the evolution of mental abilities in birds and mammals. It was a new theory. That was, I guess, a really proud moment. But life's littered with them. When I help someone with a horse and I see that they've really learned it and they can do it themselves, that's a proud moment. And it doesn't pale into insignificance compared to any other moment. So animals give you so many of those moments. When I teach an elephant in Burma to park because it's never stood still and it's really nervous, and I teach it to be relaxed and to just stand still, that's a great moment. Helping mahouts, because they're the poorest people in the world, they're usually the poorest caste in India and Nepal at least, and giving them some feeling of confidence about new knowledge. They're great moments.
All right. Now, before we go, I'd like you to give a training tip for horses and a training tip for riders, just so the listeners then can go away and learn more from this conversation that we're having. So have you got a tip that you would like to give the listeners, something to do with their horses, something to do with training, and also just something that they themselves would like, just a training exercise?
Okay. Well, first of all, a tip would be to really think about from the horse's point of view, every time they use their rein and leg pressures, what does it mean to the horse? Is that particular signal unique for a particular response? How many responses do they want? I think it's important to think about those things. That when you use your leg on the horse's sides, does it mean go? Does it mean go faster? Does it mean go longer? Does it mean go up the gate? Does it mean bend? Does it mean turn? If it's the same signal in the same place for all of those things, then that can be a problem. You can use leg pressures in different kinds of ways for different durations, and you can move them to maybe 2, maybe 3 different sites, but usually only 2 places on the girth and a little bit behind. Mm-hmm. But I think it's worth thinking about that from the horse's point of view, and remembering that no matter what people think, you can't use 2 aids together to get an efficient response, because one will overshadow the other. Mm-hmm. So I think thinking of the aids as like a symphony, but there are no chords. That's how I like to think of it, that when you ride horses, you think of it like that it's just a flow of signals, but never one blocking and overshadowing the other. And in terms of a training exercise, one thing that I like to do to give people feel, because I do believe you can teach people feel. There's a general belief, I think, that, you can't. Certainly some come to it more quickly than others, but one exercise that you can learn to get some feel through your seat and through your hands and legs is if you just go from halt and ask your horse to walk 6 steps and halt on the 6th.
Okay.
And not the 7th, not the 5th, but just on the 6th. And what you notice, I don't know, people don't tend to notice this, but the last leg to stop when you halt is usually the first leg to move. The last 4 leg, I should say. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking 6 steps of the front legs. Don't worry about the hind legs, just the 4 legs. Mm-hmm. So you do 6 steps of the 4 legs. So the last leg just to halt is the first leg to move. So obviously if you're doing it in an even number of steps, you will finish on alternate legs each time. And that will reveal one leg that tends to be always more in front of the other in the halt. And that is the diagonal pair that tends to have a little bit more flight response and running response and harder to control. It'll be the rein it's usually the right rein on which the horse is the most stiff, doesn't bend, falls out a lot on, and it's exacerbated by riders then hanging on more with the right rein in response and being right-handed perhaps. But it really originates because of the asymmetrical nature of the horse in diagonal pairs. That one diagonal pair is muscled more strongly for acceleration than the other one. And that's really a big part of my teaching, because once you get control of the diagonal pairs and you make them even, like in a sense ambidextrous, you've got lightness. The horse is so much better. But doing that 6 steps at each time, you feel it through your seat, you feel it through your reins, and you feel it through your leg in the go button. And that is just practicing that is good for horses and really good for people. And I teach many people, even at Grand Prix level, that are unable to do that because the horse always halts on the same 4 leg.
Yes.
But you should be able to halt on the 4 legs finishing.
Okay, that's an excellent exercise, and it's one that the listeners can go away with, and it doesn't matter what level they are. They could be at Grand Prix, they could be starting off, they could be but it's an excellent exercise. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you will find. I'll find too that I'll come back and say that the horse is so much better for it. It softens them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, now Andrew, what does the differences and also the similarities between elephants and horses?
Well, in terms of learning, I don't think there are very many differences. I think horses are just as quick at learning through operant conditioning, that is pressure release, as elephants are. It could be that I'm a better horse trainer than an elephant trainer, but pretty much it happens in the same speed. And there's the same variation. Some elephants take a bit longer than others and some horses take longer. But the big difference is actually in reasoning. Elephants really do see behind a lot of situations that horses don't see. So, for example, elephants are tool users, so they need a little bit of planning, because they've got a trunk.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had so many experiences along these lines where, for example, I'll ask the elephant to sit, and we've already trained him to sit.
Yep.
But instead of sitting where you tell him, he'll actually walk off and go and sit somewhere more comfortable and then look at you. And then you suddenly know there's quite a person inside there. There's somebody, and he's looking at you in that way. So that's, to me, an elephant is like a cross between a horse and a dog.
I was just going to say that's a little bit of dog behaviour there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think they're quite similar.
Uh-huh.
But there's just as big a range. There's elephants that are like Labradors, and there are others that are a little bit like Alsatians. There's quite a range.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Bearing in mind, the horses are domestic species and elephants are not at all. There's no such thing as a domestic elephant because nobody's selectively bred elephants yet,
mm-hmm.
and they never will. I think their numbers are diminishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so now what does the future hold for you?
Look, I don't really know. I live from day to day. I'm not a great planner. People often ask me how I've planned things, and I haven't. I'm hopeless at that. But things just keep evolving, and I keep moving with the flow. My elephant work is really evolving rapidly. We now have tax-deductible status for our not-for-profit charity, and we've had a lot of competition from other training groups around the world, and we are now the official training partners for the Wildlife Trust of India, for the National Elephant Institute of Thailand, and for Myanmar Timber Enterprises, which is the biggest owners of elephants in the world. They own 3,000 elephants in Burma, mm-hmm. and they're now looking at changing what they do because logging is stopped in Burma. So
that's wonderful news.
So that's yielding a lot, and the big part of that is conservation, and that's really where we're heading our work now. Is not so much, well, training will always be part of it, and that was our original drive, but the conservation issue is so important because there is so much poaching of elephants. Myanmar borders China, and the elephants just keep disappearing across the border through poaching. The biggest population of Asian elephants in the world is Myanmar, and those numbers are declining so rapidly that it's not funny. And they live all around human settlements now, which is dangerous. And the ratio of males to females is now very unhealthy. Mm-hmm. So it's looking very bad. So we need to really stop this poaching. It's outrageous. And we have some really good techniques that we want to introduce to Myanmar and Thailand in particular that have been done in India, where there are poaching controls, using elephants for poaching patrols throughout these national parks, and it's really been hugely successful in northern India to the point where it's the only place in the world where rhino numbers have actually increased.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's nothing to do with horses.
It's nice, though, to know that the knowledge that you've gained of your work with horses has been able to transfer over then to other animals.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if we all, love animals and we love horses, we shouldn't be sitting on our hands when the rest of the species on Earth are diminishing and in trouble. We should be doing as much as we can to keep this planet in good order.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. Now, I know that you've written 5 books and one of them was an international bestseller. What is, first of all, a book that would complement your books? Because what I can do is at the show notes at the end of the page, I can put links through to your books and the information about that. But what's another one that you use as a complement to your book, to what you've done?
Another book that I've written, do you mean? Or?
No, like a compliment. Say, so I'm going to put the details of all, or what, you tell the readers, the listeners, and even a summary of each of your books would be good.
Right, okay. Well, I suppose at a very academic level, we have equitation science, and we have a new edition coming out at the end of this year, and we've recruited 2 really brilliant scientists as well to give us more understanding of what goes on inside horses' heads and in biomechanics and all of these areas. And it's a massive improvement on the first edition, which we were proud of as well. Mm-hmm. I wrote that with Paul McGreevy. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing that go. And it's more user-friendly for people. It's, I think, in a lot of ways easier to read than the first book. But it's really what mankind knows about horses to this date. That's all, true and correct in science.
Okay, yep.
I wrote Academic Horse Training as a response to that book, as a practical manual, so that people could then, train horses. There's hundreds of exercises in that, and I have that on our website. And then, but the first book I wrote was The Truth About Horses, and that was the one that's been an international bestseller. And that one starts at the start and gives people an understanding why you would want a scientific approach. What does science yield? What are the pitfalls of science in that approach? And therefore how you would apply it and understand the horse's mind. And it gives some training as well. So, and there's DVD associated with some of those books. There's also, I've written a few entries for encyclopedias and textbooks of other people's as well. But they're the main books that I have. And there's also another book called Horses Hate Surprise Parties, which is written by a student of mine. And she's actually a novelist, but has been working with me for many years and knows the work so well. And she's written this for children, and it's really digestible. And so that book is, I think they're easily Googled.
Okay, and for people to find out more and to find out about you, if you can just say your website.
Our website is www.esi-education.com, and that's Equitation Science International is what our name is. And on that website they can contact me through that as well. Okay. And all the abstracts of all the papers I've ever written are on those is up there as well.
All right then. And one last thing is, what message would you like to leave people with before we say goodbye?
I'd like to leave people with the messages: don't just think of your reins are there for hanging onto and just for contact. Teach your horse really clear breaks. Teach him how to stop, slow down, shorten, and it'll become more and more subtle and more invisible with the reins, but it's definitely what the reins are for, and if you do that, you'll be safe.
Okay, wonderful. All right, thanks very much, Andrew. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.